The mad genius of Willow Creek. The autumn of 1940 brought an unusual chill to the English countryside, but it wasn't just the weather that made people shiver. German Luftwaffe planes had begun their relentless assault on Britain, their engines droning overhead like mechanical harbingers of doom. In the small village of Willow Creek, nestled between rolling hills and ancient oak forests, life had changed dramatically since the war began. Thomas Becket was not a soldier, nor was he a scientist. He was a farmer, 63 years old, with hands as rough as tree bark and a mind sharper than most men half his age. His farm had been in his family for 4 generations, and he knew every inch of his 300 acres as intimately as he knew the lines on his weathered face. But what set Thomas apart from other farmers wasn't his agricultural prowess. It was his uncanny ability to observe patterns where others saw only chaos. It started with the pheasants. Thomas had noticed that when German reconnaissance planes flew low over his property, the pheasants would scatter in predictable patterns, always fleeing perpendicular to the aircraft's trajectory. He spent weeks watching, taking notes in a leather-bound journal that he kept in his coat pocket. His neighbors thought he'd gone mad, spending his days staring at the sky instead of tending his crops. "Thomas has finally cracked," Mrs. Henderson whispered to the postman one morning. "War does terrible things to a man's mind." But Thomas wasn't mad. He was calculating. In his youth, he'd been a championship clay pigeon shooter, winning 3 county titles before settling down to run the family farm. His eyes, though aged, could still track fast-moving objects with remarkable precision, and what he'd discovered in those weeks of observation would change everything. The German planes followed routes, not random paths, but carefully plotted trajectories that took them over specific landmarks. Thomas had mapped 17 different flight paths, noting the altitude, time of day, and even the weather conditions. He noticed that on cloudy days, the reconnaissance planes flew lower, sometimes as low as 300 feet, to get clearer photographs of potential targets. One evening, as Thomas sat in his study poring over his notes by lamplight, his granddaughter Mary knocked on the door. She was 17, with her grandmother's auburn hair and a fierce intelligence that reminded Thomas of himself at that age. "Grandfather, what are you working on?" she asked, settling into the worn leather chair across from his desk. Thomas looked up, his blue eyes twinkling with an excitement she hadn't seen in months. "Mary, my dear, I think I figured something out. Something that might help." He spread his maps across the desk, showing her the flight patterns he'd documented. "These planes, they're predictable. Every Tuesday and Friday, weather permitting, a reconnaissance Messerschmitt flies this exact route at approximately 1400 hours. His gnarled finger traced a line across the map that passed directly over his eastern pasture. "But grandfather, what can we do about it? We're just farmers." Thomas smiled, a dangerous glint in his eye. "That's what everyone thinks. But I've been doing some calculations. The speed, the altitude, the trajectory, it's not so different from shooting clay pigeons. Just a much, much faster clay pigeon." Mary's eyes widened. "You can't be serious. You want to shoot at a German plane with your shotgun." "Not just any shotgun," Thomas corrected, standing and walking to a locked cabinet in the corner. He produced a key from his pocket and opened it, revealing a beautifully maintained double-barreled shotgun. "This is a Holland & Holland Royal. Custom-made, perfectly balanced, and I haven't missed a shot with it in 40 years. "But grandfather, a shotgun against a fighter plane? It's impossible." Thomas sat back down, his expression growing serious. "The RAF is stretched thin, Mary. Every day, young men barely older than you are dying in the skies trying to protect us. If there's even a chance, the smallest possibility, that I can contribute to our defense, don't I have a moral obligation to try?" The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mary studied her grandfather's face, seeing not madness but determination. Finally, she spoke. "What do you need me to do?" "The physics of the impossible." The following morning, Thomas and Mary began their unusual project in earnest. Thomas had always been methodical, a trait that served him well both as a farmer and as a competitive shooter. Now, he applied that same systematic approach to what most would consider a fool's errand. In the barn, Thomas had set up a makeshift laboratory of sorts. Scattered across a long wooden table were his journals, several books on ballistics and aerodynamics borrowed from the village library, and various implements for measuring and calculating. Mary watched as her grandfather worked through complex mathematical equations, his pencil scratching across paper with surprising speed. The challenge, Thomas explained, not looking up from his calculations, is not just hitting a moving target. It's understanding the relationship between projectile velocity, gravity, air resistance, and the target's speed and altitude. He showed Mary a diagram he'd drawn. A standard shotgun shell propels pellets at roughly 1,200 feet per second. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 reconnaissance varying cruises at approximately 290 miles per hour. That's about 425 feet per second. At 300 feet altitude, which is where they fly on cloudy days, we have a window of opportunity. Mary frowned, studying the numbers. But grandfather, shotgun pellets spread out. Won't they lose effectiveness at that range? Excellent question, Thomas said, his eyes lighting up with pride. That's exactly why this has to be done precisely right. At 300 feet, a standard shotgun pattern would spread too wide and lack penetrating power. But he paused dramatically, pulling out a small cloth bag. I've been experimenting with modified loads. Inside the bag were dozens of shotgun shells, but these weren't factory standard. Thomas had been hand-loading them with carefully measured amounts of powder and specially selected shot. Some contained larger pellets for greater impact. Others had modified wadding to tighten the shot pattern. I've test-fired 43 different combinations, Thomas said, gesturing to a ledger filled with detailed notes. I believe I found the optimal load. Number 1 buckshot with a modified plastic wad and an extra half grain of powder. It maintains pattern integrity up to 350 feet and still has sufficient energy to penetrate aluminum aircraft skin. Mary was impressed despite her doubts. You've really thought this through, haven't you? Thinking isn't enough, Thomas replied. We need to test it properly. But I can't very well practice on actual aircraft. He smiled. So I devised an alternative. That afternoon, Thomas revealed his testing apparatus. He'd rigged up a system using his tractor, a long rope, and a metal target cut from scrap aluminum to roughly simulate an aircraft's fuselage thickness. By driving the tractor at specific speeds and angles, he could create a moving target that approximated the speed and trajectory of a low-flying aircraft. Mary operated the tractor, while Thomas positioned himself in his eastern pasture with his shotgun. Over the next 3 days, they ran hundreds of trials. Thomas would call out instructions, 20 degrees left, faster, steady, and then at precisely the right moment fire. Each shot was recorded meticulously. Angle, lead time, result. The village, of course, noticed. The sound of regular shotgun fire drew attention, and soon a small crowd had gathered by Thomas's fence to watch the spectacle. The old man's finally lost it, declared Harold Pritchard, the village butcher, shooting at his own tractor. But others were more curious. Among the spectators was Lieutenant James Crawford, a young RAF officer home on medical leave after being shot down over France. He'd watched for over an hour, and what he saw wasn't madness. It was precision. After a particularly impressive sequence where Thomas successfully hit the moving target 7 times in succession, Lieutenant Crawford approached the fence. "Mr. Beckett," he called out, "might I have a word?" Thomas lowered his shotgun and walked over, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool autumn air. "Lieutenant, come to tell me I'm wasting ammunition?" Crawford smiled. "Actually, quite the opposite. I've been watching your technique. You're leading the target by exactly 4.7 seconds at that speed and angle. That's remarkably precise." Thomas's eyebrows rose. "You've been timing me?" "Old habit. Fighter pilots develop an instinct for these things." Crawford's expression grew serious. "Mr. Beckett, what exactly are you practicing for?" Thomas studied the young officer carefully. In Crawford's eyes, he saw something that gave him hope, not mockery, but genuine interest. He made a decision. "Lieutenant, if you have time, I'd like to show you something." Converting the skeptic. In Thomas's study, Lieutenant Crawford examined the maps and calculations spread across the desk with growing fascination. His initial skepticism began to waver as he recognized the sophistication of Thomas's work. This wasn't the rambling of a confused old man. It was genuine tactical analysis. These flight patterns, Crawford said, tracing one of the routes with his finger, they're accurate. We've known about these reconnaissance runs, but haven't been able to spare fighters to intercept them consistently. They're considered low priority compared to bomber formations. Thomas nodded grimly, which is exactly why they're so dangerous. These reconnaissance flights are gathering intelligence for future attacks. Every photograph they take, every detail they observe, puts more British lives at risk. Crawford pulled up a chair, his interest fully engaged now. Walk me through your plan. For the next 2 hours, Thomas laid out his strategy. He had identified 4 locations on his property where the flight path passed directly overhead at optimal altitude. He'd calculated the exact lead time needed to hit a target traveling at the Messerschmitt speed. He'd even factored in the delay between pulling the trigger and the pellets reaching their target. Approximately 1/4 of a second. The key, Thomas explained, is not to aim where the plane is, but where it will be. Just like shooting clay pigeons, but with much more precise calculations. I've been training my muscle memory to account for the specific speed and altitude. Crawford was quiet for a moment, processing everything he'd heard. Finally, he spoke. Mr. Beckett, I'm going to be honest with you. The odds of actually bringing down an aircraft with shotgun are astronomical. The plane would have to be at exactly the right altitude. The weather conditions would have to be perfect, and you'd need to hit something critical, the engine, the cockpit, control surfaces. And even then, modern aircraft are remarkably resilient to small arms fire. I know all of that, Thomas said calmly. But there's another factor you're not considering. These reconnaissance planes fly alone and unarmed. Their only defense is speed and altitude. If a pilot encounters unexpected ground fire, especially if it actually damages the aircraft, what does he do? Crawford's eyes widened slightly. He breaks off the run, changes altitude, alters course. The mission is compromised. Exactly, Thomas said with satisfaction. I may not be able to shoot down a plane, Lieutenant, but I might be able to disrupt their intelligence gathering. And if I can do that even once, it could save lives. Crawford stood, pacing the small study. His mind raced through the tactical implications. If you could even damage one aircraft, force it to return to base early, it would interrupt their reconnaissance schedule. They have to investigate what happened, possibly change their routes. It could buy us valuable time. More than that, Thomas added, imagine the psychological impact. German pilots feeling vulnerable during what they consider safe reconnaissance runs. Command having to divert resources to investigate and counter this threat. It's asymmetric warfare, Lieutenant. One farmer with one shotgun, creating disproportionate disruption. Crawford turned back to Thomas, and for the first time since arriving, he smiled. You're not crazy, Mr. Beckett. You're brilliant. But you're also talking about taking on the German Luftwaffe with hunting equipment. Even if I believe in the tactical value, even if your calculations are perfect, you're putting yourself in tremendous danger. If they identify the source of fire, they could send fighters to destroy your farm. Or worse, the Gestapo might hear about it if they occupy Britain. If they occupy Britain, Thomas said firmly, then nothing we do now will matter anyway. We must resist with every means at our disposal. Crawford studied the old farmer for a long moment. He saw determination, intelligence, and something else, a quiet courage that put Crawford's own bravery to shame. Here was a man twice his age, with no military training, willing to stand alone against the might of the German war machine. What do you need from me? Crawford asked finally. Thomas's face broke into a broad smile. 2 things. First, I need you to verify my intelligence about the flight schedules. You have access to information I don't. Second, I need you to be ready to report what happens. If this works, the military should know about it. If it doesn't work, he paused. Well, at least someone should know an old farmer tried. Crawford extended his hand. You have my word, Mr. Beckett. I'll get you the most current intelligence we have. And I'll make sure your efforts are properly documented, regardless of the outcome. As they shook hands, Mary appeared in the doorway. "Grandfather, there's a storm coming in. The wireless says heavy clouds tomorrow afternoon." Thomas and Crawford exchanged meaningful looks. Heavy clouds meant low-flying reconnaissance aircraft. "Tomorrow then," Thomas said quietly. "After all this preparation, tomorrow we find out if an old farmer's crazy trick can actually work." The gathering storm. The morning of October 15th, 1940, dawned gray and heavy with moisture. Thomas had barely slept, lying awake in his bed listening to the wind rattle the windows and thinking through every aspect of his plan. By the time he rose at dawn, the clouds hung so low they seemed to touch the tops of the oak trees that bordered his property. Mary was already in the kitchen when he came downstairs. She prepared his usual breakfast, porridge with honey and a strong cup of tea, but neither of them had much appetite. The way of what they were about to attempt hung between them like the storm clouds outside. "You don't have to do this, Grandfather," Mary said softly, breaking the silence. "No one would blame you for changing your mind." Thomas reached across the table and patted her hand. "My dear girl, when your grandmother and I married, I made a promise at that altar. I promised to protect our family, to protect our home. That promise didn't end when she died. If anything, it became more important. But this is so dangerous." "So is doing nothing," Thomas interrupted gently. "Every day, young men like Lieutenant Crawford risk their lives to protect us. The least I can do is try to help, even in my small way. Your grandmother would understand." At 10 o'clock, Lieutenant Crawford arrived on a motorcycle, mud splattered across his uniform from the wet roads. He carried a leather satchel filled with papers and maps. "The latest intelligence," he said, spreading documents across the kitchen table. "Reconnaissance Messerschmitt Bf 109 times 10 to the power of -7. Tail number unclear. Confirmed route over Willow Creek at approximately 1400 hours, weather permitting. Current cloud ceiling is estimated at 300 to 400 feet. Perfect conditions for your purposes." The three of them reviewed the flight path one final time. Crawford had even managed to obtain a recent photograph of a similar aircraft, pointing out the critical areas: engine cowling, cockpit canopy, control surfaces on the wings and tail. "Remember," Crawford said, his voice taking on the tone of a tactical briefing, "you want to lead the target by approximately 20 feet at 300 feet altitude. That accounts for the aircraft speed and the travel time of your shot. The moment you hear the engine, start tracking. The moment you see it break through the clouds, assess altitude and speed. Then fire when it reaches this point." He marked an X on the map, "relative to that large oak tree you've been using as your landmark." Thomas nodded, absorbing every detail. His years of competitive shooting had taught him to stay calm under pressure, to trust his training and instincts. He would need all of that today. By noon, Thomas was in position in his eastern pasture. He'd chosen a spot that offered the best vantage point, while providing some concealment among a cluster of hawthorn bushes. His Holland & Holland shotgun was loaded with the specially prepared shells, and a dozen more were arranged within easy reach on a flat rock beside him. Mary had taken a position about 50 yards away with binoculars, ready to spot and call out details. Crawford, at his insistence, remained hidden in the barn with his own binoculars and a notebook. If things went wrong, he needed to be able to report what happened without being directly implicated. The minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. Thomas remained motionless, using meditation techniques he'd learned as a young shooter. Steady breathing, clear mind, trust the training. At 13:45, Mary's voice came across the clearing, quiet but urgent. "I can hear something. Northeast, approaching fast." Thomas's eyes snapped open, his senses suddenly hyper-alert. Yes, there was the distant drone of an aircraft engine, growing steadily louder. The sound echoed strangely off the low clouds, making it difficult to pinpoint exact location. But Thomas trusted his calculations. If the pilot was following the standard route, he would appear over the oak tree in approximately 45 seconds. He raised the shotgun to his shoulder, feeling its familiar weight settle into place. 40 years of muscle memory took over. His breathing slowed, deepened. The world seemed to narrow to just him, the gun, and the approaching sound. 30 seconds. The engine noise grew louder. Clearly now a single aircraft, the distinctive snarl of a Daimler-Benz engine at cruise power. 20 seconds. Thomas's finger rested lightly on the trigger. Not yet. Timing was everything. 10 seconds. The sound was directly overhead now, but still masked by clouds. Where was it? And then, like a gray ghost emerging from gray mist, the Messerschmitt broke through the cloud ceiling, exactly where Thomas had predicted it would be. 320 feet altitude, 285 miles per hour. Black cross on silver wings. Time seemed to slow. Thomas's body moved with practiced precision. Tracked the target. Led by 20 feet. Smooth motion, no jerking. Squeeze, don't pull. The shotgun roared, the recoil familiar and manageable against his experienced shoulder. Without thinking, he broke the action, ejected the spent shell, loaded another, closed the action, and fired again. 2 shots in less than 3 seconds. For a moment, nothing happened. The Messerschmitt continued on its path, engine unchanged, no visible damage. Thomas's heart sank. Had he missed? Had all the preparation been for nothing? Then, from Crawford's position in the barn, came a shout of astonishment. Hit! You've hit it! I can see damage to the right wing surface. The impossible shot. The Messerschmitt's engine note changed almost immediately. Not dramatically, but enough that Thomas's trained ear caught the subtle difference. The smooth roar developed a slight roughness, a hesitation in the power delivery. Through the binoculars, Mary could see what Crawford had spotted, a pattern of small perforations along the right wing's trailing edge, near the aileron. It's breaking off. Mary called out, her voice pitched high with excitement and disbelief. It's turning away. Indeed, the aircraft was banking to the right, abandoning its reconnaissance run. The pilot was clearly attempting to gain altitude, climbing back into protective-covered clouds. But something was wrong with the aircraft's handling. The turn was sluggish, uncoordinated. At least one of the shotgun pellets had damaged something critical. Crawford burst from the barn, abandoning any pretense of staying hidden. He'd seen combat, witnessed countless aerial engagements, but what he'd just observed defied everything he knew about aerial warfare. Thomas Beckett, a 63-year-old farmer, had just damaged a German fighter aircraft with a sporting shotgun. Do you realize what you've just done? Crawford shouted as he ran across the pasture. You've actually hit a moving aircraft at 300 feet with a shotgun. This is impossible. This is absolutely impossible. Thomas lowered his weapon, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through his 73-year-old body. Is it damaged enough to bring it down? Crawford raised his binoculars, tracking the wounded aircraft as it struggled to gain altitude. I don't think so. You've damaged control surfaces, probably degraded its ability to maneuver, but the engine sounds mostly intact. But, Mr. Beckett, that's not the point. You've proven it can be done. You've proven that ground fire from conventional weapons can threaten low-flying reconnaissance aircraft. Mary reached them, breathless. Should we report it? Should we tell someone? We absolutely must report it, Crawford said, his mind already racing to the tactical implications. But first, we need to document everything. Every detail, while it's fresh in our memory. And we need to find where your shots landed, see if we can recover any physical evidence. Over the next hour, they scoured the pasture and surrounding area. They found 3 shotgun pellets embedded in tree trunks and fence posts, the misses. But the hits? Those were flying back to German-occupied France inside the skin of a damaged Messerschmitt. Physical proof of what most would consider impossible. Crawford filled his notebook with detailed observations. Weather conditions, aircraft altitude and speed, Thomas's position, distance to target, lead time, shot pattern, visible damage. He sketched diagrams and made calculations, cross-referencing Thomas's methods with established ballistics principles. The wind was minimal, Crawford muttered as he wrote. Cloud ceiling at approximately 320 feet. Target speed estimated at 285 miles per hour. Shooter positioned 43 feet above, surrounding terrain on slight rise. 2 shots fired, both connecting with target. Primary damage to right wing control surfaces. Secondary damage unknown but suspected engine cowling, or fuel system based on engine note change. As Crawford worked, Thomas sat on a nearby stone wall, suddenly feeling every one of the 63 years. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a profound exhaustion. Mary sat beside him, her arm around his shoulders. "You did it, grandfather," she said softly. "You actually did it." Thomas smiled wearily. "We did it, my dear. You and Crawford helped." But now comes the hard part, convincing people that it wasn't just blind luck. Crawford looked up from his notebook. "Oh, it wasn't luck. The mathematics prove that. The repeated training trials prove that. The fact that both shots connected proves that. This was skill, Mr. Beckett. Pure skill combined with scientific method. You've invented a new form of aerial defense. But will anyone believe it?" Mary asked, "An old farmer shooting down? Well, damaging. A German plane with a hunting shotgun? It sounds like something from a pulp novel." "I'll make them believe it," Crawford said with determination. "I'm a commissioned officer in the Royal Air Force. My testimony will carry weight. And once they understand the tactical implications, they'll have to take it seriously. Imagine if we could train Home Guard units across Britain to do this. Thousands of men with shotguns, all capable of threatening low-flying reconnaissance aircraft. It would force the Luftwaffe to fly higher, use more fuel, take fewer photographs. It would be a force multiplier of enormous proportions." Thomas shook his head slowly. "I think you're overestimating how replicable this is, Lieutenant. It took me months of observation, weeks of practice, and very specific conditions. Most men with shotguns couldn't do what I just did." "Perhaps not," Crawford conceded, "but some could. Veterans, experienced hunters, competitive shooters, men with the right combination of skill and temperament. And even if only a small percentage succeed, the Germans don't know that. The psychological impact alone could be significant. Imagine being a Luftwaffe pilot, knowing that even routine reconnaissance runs might draw ground fire from unexpected sources. It would be like having thousands of additional anti-aircraft positions that can't be mapped or targeted." The three of them fell silent, each contemplating the implications of what had just occurred. The drizzle had intensified into steady rain, and in the distance, thunder rumbled. The storm was arriving in earnest. "We should get inside," Thomas said finally. "There's nothing more to be done out here, and we all need dry clothes and hot tea. Lieutenant, will you stay for dinner? We have much to discuss." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, none of them noticed the figure watching from the edge of the woods, a man in civilian clothes with a camera around his neck who had been photographing Thomas's property for very different reasons than German reconnaissance. He'd seen the entire engagement, and his mind was already formulating how to report this most unusual incident to his superiors in London. The story of Thomas Beckett's impossible shot was about to spread far beyond Willow Creek, and the consequences would be more far-reaching than any of them could imagine. Word spreads. 3 days after the incident, Thomas's quiet farm became considerably less quiet. It started with a visit from the local Home Guard commander, Captain Edwards, accompanied by 2 men in civilian suits who declined to provide their names but carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of military intelligence officers. They'd heard Crawford's report. They'd seen his photographs and read his detailed tactical analysis, and they wanted to see Thomas demonstrate his technique firsthand. "Mr. Beckett," one of the suited men said, his accent marking him as upper-class London, "we understand you've developed an, shall we say, unconventional method of aerial defense. We'd like to observe a demonstration." Thomas exchanged glances with Mary and Crawford, who had returned specifically for this meeting. "Gentlemen, I must emphasize that what I did was a result of months of preparation under very specific conditions. It's not easily reproducible." "We understand that," the second suited man said. "Nevertheless, we need to evaluate whether your method has any practical application for broader defense purposes. If you could show us your technique." So, for the second time in a week, Thomas found himself in his eastern pasture with his Holland and Holland shotgun. But this time, instead of a German reconnaissance plane, the target was Crawford's idea, a large kite modified to carry a small engine and remote control system capable of flying at varying speeds and altitudes. The intelligence officers watched through field glasses as Thomas tracked the unmanned kite, leading it precisely, adjusting for windage and altitude. He fired 6 shots over the course of an hour. For connected, the kite's fabric shredding from the impact of buckshot. The suited men took extensive notes. That evening, as they prepared to leave, the London-accented officer pulled Thomas aside. "Mr. Beckett, what you've demonstrated today is remarkable, statistically improbable, but undeniably real. However, I must caution you about something important. Word of this incident is going to spread, and not all the attention will be welcome. The Germans will eventually learn about it, and they may decide to make an example of you." Thomas nodded gravely. "I consider that risk." "Have you considered the risk to your village? To Mary? If the Luftwaffe decide to retaliate, they won't limit themselves to just your farm. What would you have me do?" Thomas asked. "Pretend it never happened? Allow the Germans to fly unmolested?" "Of course not," the officer said. "We want to use your technique. Train others, create a distributed defense system. But we need to be smart about it. Discreet. If we publicize this too widely, it becomes propaganda that could endanger civilians. But if we keep it quiet and strategic, it becomes a tactical advantage." By the end of the week, Thomas found himself at a rural RAF base in Scotland, addressing a room full of Home Guard commanders and senior officers. His story had reached the highest levels of British military command, and now they wanted to know if it could be systematically applied. "The key factor," Thomas explained, standing before a detailed diagram of his technique, "is not the weapon, it's the preparation. Understanding the target's behavior, calculating trajectories, endless practice. Most importantly, having the right conditions, altitude, weather, positioning. Remove any one of these elements, and the probability of success drops dramatically." A gruff colonel from the Home Guard stood up. "Are you telling us this was a fluke, Mr. Beckett?" "No, sir," Thomas replied firmly. "It was not a fluke. It was a result of systematic observation and preparation. But it was also fortunate. I had months to study the flight patterns. I had ideal terrain. I had decades of shooting experience. How many men have that combination?" "More than you'd think," another officer chimed in. "Britain has thousands of experienced hunters and sportsmen. If we could identify the right candidates, provide them with proper intelligence about enemy flight paths, and position them strategically." The discussion continued for hours, late into the night. Thomas found himself at the center of what was becoming a significant tactical innovation. The military brass was seeing potential he'd never imagined. Not just individual shooters taking opportunistic shots, but coordinated network of ground observers who could threaten low-altitude reconnaissance and harassment operations across the country. But there was another development Thomas didn't know about yet. In Berlin, German intelligence had received reports of the damaged Messerschmitt, and its pilots accounted ground fire from an unexpected source. The Wehrmacht was not pleased. Orders went out to investigate and, if possible, identify and neutralize this new threat. Meanwhile, back in Willow Creek, Mary was managing the farm alone. She'd become accustomed to curious visitors. Neighbors wanted to hear the story firsthand, journalists from local newspapers, even a filmmaker from London who wanted to make a short documentary about the farmer who shot at fighters. One evening, as she was closing up the barn, a stranger approached her. He was middle-aged, dressed in working-class clothes, and spoke with an accent she couldn't quite place. "Excuse me, miss," he said politely. "I'm looking for Thomas Beckett. I heard he's quite the marksman. I'd like to talk to him about hunting techniques." Something about the man made Mary uneasy. The accent was off, the story too convenient. She remembered the intelligence officer's warning about German attention. "My grandfather is away on business," she said carefully. "I don't know when he'll return." "That's unfortunate," the man said, his eyes scanning the farm buildings. "Perhaps I could wait? Or leave a message?" "I don't think so," Mary replied, her hand moving toward the pitchfork leaning against the barn wall. "I think you should leave now." The man's friendly demeanor dropped slightly. "I think you're being unnecessarily hostile, miss. I'm just a curious hunter." "And I think you're not British," Mary said firmly. "So I'll ask one more time. Leave Now, for a tense moment, the man stared at her. Then, surprisingly, he smiled, not a friendly smile, but one of respect. You're clever, like your grandfather. Give him a message for me. Tell him he's made powerful enemies. What he did was impressive, but it would be wise for him to stop now, before something regrettable happens. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the evening mist. Mary stood frozen for several minutes, her heart pounding, before running to the house to telephone Lieutenant Crawford. The game had changed. Thomas's impossible shot hadn't just proven a point. It had declared war in a very personal way. And the enemy was now paying attention. Legacy of the impossible. 2 months after Thomas Beckett's historic shot, the strategic landscape of the Battle of Britain had shifted in ways both large and small. The German Luftwaffe, unable to gain air superiority, had begun scaling back daylight raids. But in the shadows, a different kind of warfare was unfolding, one that Thomas had inadvertently helped create. The man who had visited Mary turned out to be exactly what she suspected, a German intelligence agent operating in rural England. Crawford's network uncovered 3 others in surrounding counties, all investigating reports of unconventional ground-based air defense. The publicity surrounding Thomas's shot, despite efforts to contain it, had drawn unwanted attention, but it had also inspired something unexpected. Across Britain, from the Scottish Highlands to the Cornish coast, experienced shooters began studying the skies. Home Guard units established observation posts. Rural communities organized volunteer watches. The military, initially skeptical, had created training programs for what they officially called low-altitude interdiction units, though everyone called them Beckett teams. Thomas himself had become a reluctant celebrity and instructor. He'd spent weeks at various military installations, teaching his observation and calculation techniques to selected Home Guard members. Of the 200 men initially trained, perhaps 30 had the combination of skill, patience, and geometric intuition to consistently threaten low-flying aircraft. But 30 was 30 more than had existed before. In January 1941, 3 separate incidents were recorded of German reconnaissance aircraft taking damage from ground fire in rural areas. 2 were definitely from Home Guard shotgun teams using Thomas's methods. The third might have been anti-aircraft fire, but the Germans didn't know that. What they knew was that their low-altitude reconnaissance operations over Britain had become unexpectedly hazardous. German tactical doctrine adapted. Reconnaissance flights were ordered to maintain higher altitudes when possible. Routes were randomized. Some missions were canceled entirely when weather conditions forced low-altitude flight. The strategic impact was modest, but real. Hundreds of intelligence photographs not taken, dozens of missions compromised, countless hours of analysis wasted trying to counter a threat that was, in truth, quite limited. The psychological impact was greater. Luftwaffe pilots, already demoralized by the RAF's fierce resistance, now had to worry about ground fire from unexpected sources. The myth grew larger than the reality, which was exactly what British intelligence wanted. But there were costs. In late February, the Luftwaffe conducted a retaliatory raid on Willow Creek. They didn't know exactly where Thomas lived. German intelligence had been unable to confirm his identity with certainty, so they bombed the entire village. 8 people died. 23 homes were destroyed. Mary's school was reduced to rubble. Thomas stood in the ruins of the village square, his heart breaking. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had called him mad, had died in her home. The postman who had dismissed his efforts had lost both legs when the post office collapsed. And young William Fletcher, just 15 years old, had been killed while trying to rescue his dog from a burning building. "This is my fault," Thomas said quietly to Crawford, who had come as soon as he heard. "All of this, because I couldn't leave well enough alone." Crawford gripped the old farmer's shoulder. "No, Thomas, this is war. The Germans did this, not you, and you need to understand something else. Because of what you did, because of the program you inspired, we've disrupted their intelligence operations across southern England. The invasion plans they're making are based on incomplete information. You've helped save lives, even if we can't count them." "But I can count these," Thomas said, gesturing at the destruction. 8 people. I knew them all. Mrs. Henderson used to bring me apple pie every harvest. And now she's dead because the Germans wanted to get to me. Mary, her face smudged with ash from fighting fires all night, joined them. Grandfather, stop. Just stop. Mrs. Henderson died because Nazi bombers dropped explosives on our village. You didn't kill her. They did. And if you hadn't done what you did, if you hadn't proven it was possible to fight back with whatever we have, how many more people would die when the invasion comes? If it comes, Crawford corrected quietly. Intelligence suggests the Germans are having second thoughts. Partly because of the RAF, partly because of our naval supremacy, but also partly because they're uncertain about the level of resistance they'd face. Every act of defiance, from RAF pilots to Home Guard shotgun teams to civilians refusing to give up, it all adds up. It all matters. Thomas looked at his granddaughter. Seeing a strength in her he'd always known was there, but had never been tested like this. She'd turned 17 in the midst of war, and it had forged her into someone remarkable. What do we do now? He asked. We rebuild, Mary said simply. We rebuild the village. We keep watching the skies. We keep fighting in whatever way we can. Because that's what grandmother would have done. That's what all of them would have wanted us to do. Over the following months, Willow Creek slowly rebuilt. The government provided assistance, but it was the community itself that provided the real strength. Neighbors helped neighbors. Families took in the displaced. And through it all, Thomas continued his vigil, though now he was far more careful, far more discreet. The Beckett teams continued their operations throughout 1941 and into 1942, though as the war progressed and aerial operations changed, their relevance diminished. But the principle remained. Ordinary people with ordinary weapons, properly trained and positioned, could contribute to the defense of their nation. In 1943, Thomas received a private visit from a senior RAF officer who brought a letter from Winston Churchill himself. It thanked him for his service and innovation, noting that while his contribution couldn't be publicly acknowledged during wartime, it would not be forgotten. The letter concluded, You have proven that the spirit of British resistance cannot be measured in guns or planes alone, but in the courage and ingenuity of individuals willing to stand against tyranny with whatever means they possess. Thomas kept the letter in his desk drawer, next to his wife's photograph and his grandfather's pocket watch. He never spoke publicly about it, never sought recognition. When journalists came to write about the farmer who shot fighters, he politely declined interviews. In 1956, 11 years after the war ended, Thomas Beckett died peacefully in his sleep at age 79. His funeral was attended by over 300 people, including several former RAF officers, 24 Home Guard veterans, and a handful of men who had been part of the Beckett teams. They knew what he contributed, even if the world didn't. Mary inherited the farm and the Holland shotgun. She kept it in its case, properly maintained but never fired again. She'd tell her children and grandchildren about their great-grandfather, about the impossible shot and the principle it represented. That ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they combine courage, skill, and determination. The Messerschmitt that Thomas damaged never flew again. It was scrapped in France. Its damaged wing panels a silent testament to an event that most people would consider impossible. But in the small museum of a rural RAF station in Scotland, there's a display case containing a leather-bound journal, several shotgun shells, and a faded photograph of a weathered old farmer holding a double-barreled shotgun. The placard simply reads, Thomas Beckett, 1877 to 1956, inventor of low-altitude interdiction techniques. Proof that impossibility is merely a failure of imagination. And on quiet autumn evenings in Willow Creek, when the clouds hang low and the sound of distant aircraft echoes across the fields, old-timers still tell the story of the mad genius farmer who took on the Luftwaffe with a shotgun and proved that one person, in the right place at the right time with the right preparation, really can make a difference. The technique Thomas invented was never widely adopted after the war. Modern aerial warfare made it obsolete, but the principle endured. That defense of one's home and nation isn't limited to professional soldiers, that ingenuity can overcome technological disadvantage, and that courage comes in many forms, including that of a 63-year-old farmer standing in a field with a hunting shotgun, calculating trajectories and believing in the impossible. In the end, Thomas Becket didn't change the course of World War II, but he changed the course of one reconnaissance mission, disrupted one intelligence gathering operation, and inspired hundreds of ordinary people to believe they could contribute to something larger than themselves. And perhaps that's the real legacy of Impossible Shots. Not the technical achievement, but the belief it instills that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the need arises. The war moved on. The world changed. But in a quiet corner of England, the memory remains the day when one farmer's crazy trick stopped being crazy and became legendary. Retry S.